The number 3 engine quit at exactly the wrong moment. Not during the bomb run over Schweinfurt, not during the initial climb over England, but here, 23,000 feet over Germany, with 90 miles still to go before reaching Allied airspace. Lieutenant Robert Kellerman felt the B-17 shudder as the propeller windmilled uselessly, and he knew what came next. Every German fighter within 20 miles would see the crippled bomber falling behind its formation, and they would come like wolves to a wounded deer. His hands moved across the controls with practiced precision, adjusting throttle settings on the 3 remaining engines, trying to coax every possible ounce of speed from the dying aircraft. Through the frosted cockpit glass, he watched the rest of the 381st Bomb Group gradually pull ahead, their tight defensive formation growing smaller against the pale winter sky. The Boeing B-17G Flying Fortress had earned its name honestly. 13 50-caliber machine guns positioned at every conceivable angle: nose, tail, waist, ball turret, dorsal, and chin turret. Later models would add 3 more for a total of 16. The Army Air Force had sold it as practically invincible, a bomber that could defend itself against any fighter attack. But Kellerman knew something the promotional films never mentioned, something every combat crew learned within their first few missions over occupied Europe. All those guns meant absolutely nothing if you fell behind. It was December 11, 1943, somewhere over the frozen farmland between Emden and the Dutch border. Kellerman's crew, the 9 other men scattered throughout Dragon's Breath as they'd christened their aircraft, had just completed their 14th mission. 14 runs deep into Hitler's industrial heartland. 14 times they'd made it back to Ridgewell Airfield in England. The date had been circled on Kellerman's mental calendar for weeks, not because of the mission itself, but because it marked exactly 6 months since he'd watched his older brother's B-17 spiral out of formation over Bremen, bracketed by flak and swarmed by Messerschmitt Bf-109s. 6 months since he'd learned what happened to stragglers. "Skip, we've got company." The voice of his top turret gunner, Staff Sergeant Eddie Kozlowski, crackled through the intercom. 2 o'clock high. Make that 4. No, 6 bandits, FW-190s. Kellerman's co-pilot, Second Lieutenant James Harmon, gripped his control yoke tighter. "Can we maintain formation speed on 3 engines?" But Kellerman didn't answer. His eyes were locked on the altimeter, spinning slowly counterclockwise, the airspeed indicator dropping despite his desperate adjustments. The last B-17 in the formation's trailing element was now a full quarter-mile ahead, the gap widening with each passing second. The numbers told a brutal story. At their current rate of descent and speed loss, they'd be completely isolated in less than 2 minutes. Beyond the protective overlapping fields of fire from neighboring bombers, beyond the mutual support that made the combat box formation so effective. "They're peeling off from the formation," Kozlowski reported, his voice steady despite the terror every gunner felt when German fighters singled them out. "Coming for us." Harmon's eyes darted between the engine instruments and the distant formation. "We should salvage the remaining bombs. Might give us enough speed to—" "Hold formation speed," Kellerman interrupted, still fighting the controls. Because he knew what happened next, had seen it happen to his brother and a dozen other crews. The moment a B-17 fell behind, it became a test, a proving ground where German pilots discovered that the mighty Flying Fortress wasn't so mighty after all. No one in the 381st Bomb Group knew that the next 8 minutes would expose the fatal flaw in America's most celebrated bomber, a weakness that had already cost hundreds of air crews their lives. And no one could have predicted that a farm boy from Nebraska, who'd once been rejected from pilot training for poor eyesight, would be the one to survive long enough to reveal the terrible truth. Robert James Kellerman was born on March 3, 1921, in the small farming community of McCook, Nebraska. the second of 3 children to wheat farmers who'd barely survived the Depression. His father, William Kellerman, worked 640 acres of stubborn prairie land that yielded just enough to keep the family fed and the bank at bay. Young Robert showed an early fascination with anything mechanical. While his older brother Thomas excelled at the physical labor of farming, Robert spent hours taking apart and reassembling the farm's tractor, studying how each component worked together. His father used to joke that Robert could hear a machine's problems before they happened, the way some men could smell rain coming. But at age 12, during a routine school examination, Robert's world narrowed. The nurse noticed he squinted constantly, struggling to read the chalkboard from the back row. An optometrist in North Platte delivered the diagnosis: severe astigmatism in both eyes, significant enough to require thick corrective lenses. "You'll never be a pilot," the doctor said matter-of-factly, as if discussing the weather. "Army won't take anyone who needs glasses to see straight." For most boys in 1933 Nebraska, this would have meant little. But Robert had spent countless nights lying in the wheat fields, watching the few aircraft that passed overhead, imagining himself at the controls. The diagnosis felt like a door slamming shut. Thomas, meanwhile, seemed destined for everything Robert couldn't have: perfect vision, natural athleticism, the kind of easy confidence that made people follow him. When Thomas announced in 1940 that he was joining the Army Air Corps, Robert felt the old wound reopen. Then came December 7, 1941. Robert was listening to the radio in the front room when the bulletin interrupted the Sunday afternoon music program. Pearl Harbor, Japanese attack. Within hours, America was at war, and every able-bodied young man in McCook was talking about enlisting. "I'm going," Thomas said that evening, eyes bright with purpose. Already talked to the recruiter in town. They're fast-tracking applications for pilot training. Robert said nothing. He wanted to go too. Wanted it so badly his chest ached. But the eye exam would disqualify him before he even started. His mother, sensing his thoughts, placed a hand on his shoulder. "Robert, there are other ways to serve. Important ways." But Thomas surprised them both. "Bob's coming with me. They need navigators, bombardiers, flight engineers. Hell, they'll need so many men they might even waive some requirements." Thomas was half right. When the brothers went to the recruitment office in January 1942, Robert was indeed rejected for pilot training. But his brother's persistence and Robert's mechanical aptitude earned him a spot in navigator training. It wasn't the cockpit, but it was airborne. For 6 months, Robert excelled at navigation school in San Marcos, Texas. He mastered celestial navigation, dead reckoning, and wind drift calculations. But his heart remained in the left seat, hands on the controls. Then, in July 1942, everything changed. The Army Air Force, hemorrhaging pilots faster than training could replace them, quietly adjusted vision requirements. Corrected vision of 20/20 would now be acceptable for pilot candidates. Robert applied immediately. This time, wearing his thick glasses during the examination, he passed. "Don't make me regret this waiver," the examining officer warned. "You'll be flying men who are counting on you to see clearly." "I see perfectly, sir," Robert replied. "I just need help doing it." Flight training at Coleman, Texas, proved every doubter wrong. Robert might have needed glasses, but his mechanical intuition made him a natural pilot. He understood aircraft not just as vehicles, but as systems, complex machines that revealed their secrets to anyone patient enough to listen. By the time Robert pinned on his pilot wings in March 1943, Thomas was already flying combat missions over Europe, his letters filled with descriptions of the mighty B-17 flying fortress and the brotherhood of combat crews. "Stick with me, little brother," Thomas wrote. "We'll fly together and come home together." Robert Kellerman first laid eyes on a B-17 flying fortress at MacDill Field in Florida, where newly minted pilots received transition training on heavy bombers. The aircraft sat on the tarmac like a monument to American industrial might, 65 feet long, 103-foot wingspan, four massive Wright R-1820 Cyclone engines capable of producing 1,200 horsepower each. But what captured everyone's attention were the guns. 13 50-caliber Browning machine guns, the instructor, Captain Dale Morrison, announced with obvious pride during the orientation briefing. Twin guns in the tail, dorsal and ball turrets. Single guns in the nose, both waist positions, and the radio room. The new G model adds a chin turret with two more guns. 16 total defensive positions when fully configured. Morrison walked around a cross-section diagram, pointing to each gun position. Overlapping fields of fire covering every approach angle. The Germans learned the hard way in '42 that frontal attacks on B-17 formations result in unacceptable losses. This aircraft can defend itself better than any bomber ever built. The other pilots in Kellerman's training class leaned forward, captivated. These were men who'd grown up hearing stories about World War I bombers, fragile covers, and wood contraptions protected by maybe one or two defensive guns. The B-17 seemed like science fiction in comparison. The key to survival, Morrison continued, is the combat box formation. 18 to 21 aircraft flying in tight formation, their defensive guns creating an interlocking shield. Any German fighter attacking the formation must fly through a curtain of 50-caliber fire from multiple aircraft simultaneously. Morrison showed film footage from recent missions over Europe. B-17s in perfect formation. German fighters making half-hearted passes before breaking away, unwilling to press attacks against such concentrated firepower. The narration called it the bomber that can defend itself. Kellerman studied every technical manual, memorized every system. The B-17's capabilities were impressive. Service ceiling of 35,000 feet, maximum speed of 287 mph, range of nearly 2,000 miles with a 4,500-pound bomb load. But it was the defensive armament that defined the aircraft's reputation. During his first training flight, seated in the left seat of a war-weary B-70F, Kellerman felt the aircraft's power and understood its promise. This wasn't just a bomber, it was a fortress that happened to fly. He completed transition training in May 1943 and received orders to join the 381st Bomb Group at Ridgewell, England. The assignment felt like destiny when he learned Thomas was stationed at the same base, flying with the 379th Bomb Group just across the field. They reunited in the Officers' Club on Robert's second night in England. Thomas, now a first lieutenant with 8 missions under his belt, looked older than his 24 years. The easy confidence was still there, but it carried weight now. "The fort's everything they say it is," Thomas told him over warm beer. "Long as you stay in formation, the Krauts won't touch you. It's the stragglers who—" He trailed off, staring into his glass. "Who what?" Robert pressed. Thomas met his eyes. "Just don't fall behind, Bobby. No matter what. Engine out. Hydraulics shot to hell. Doesn't matter. You keep up with the formation, or you don't come home." Robert laughed it off as veteran mystique, the experienced pilot hazing the new guy. The training films, the technical briefings, the gun specifications, everything said the B-17 could handle itself. His first mission briefing on June 13, 1943, reinforced that confidence. The target was Bremen. The formation would include 120 bombers, and their defensive firepower would be overwhelming. What Kellerman didn't know, what none of the replacement crews knew, was that the Luftwaffe had already figured out the Flying Fortress's fatal weakness, and they were waiting for anyone foolish enough to fly alone. Hauptmann Klaus Hoffmann of Jagdgeschwader 26 had learned to respect the American bombers, but respect didn't mean fear. It meant understanding, and understanding led to victory. He'd been flying Focke-Wulf FW-190s against Allied bombers since early 1942, back when the first B-17s appeared over occupied France. Those early encounters had been almost sporting. The American formations were loose, defensive fire uncoordinated, and German fighters could attack from any angle with relative impunity. Then the Americans learned. By mid-1943, the combat box formations had become murderously effective. Hoffman had watched 3 good pilots die in a single week trying frontal attacks against tightly grouped B-17s. The overlapping defensive fire was exactly as advertised, a nearly impenetrable shield when the bombers flew in proper formation. It's like attacking a porcupine from the outside, Hoffman's wingman, Lieutenant Werner Dietrich, had observed after a particularly costly engagement. Every direction you approach, you get quills. But Hoffman had noticed something during a mission over Hamburg in August 1943. A B-17 with engine damage had fallen behind its formation, struggling to maintain altitude and speed. Separated from the protective umbrella of neighboring bombers, it became an entirely different target. He'd led his Schwarm 4-aircraft flight in a coordinated attack, carefully exploiting the gaps in the lone bomber's defensive coverage. The B-17's 13 guns seemed impressive until you realized they couldn't all fire in the same direction simultaneously. The tail guns couldn't protect against attacks from the nose. The ball turret had limited traverse. The waist guns created blind spots that a skilled pilot could exploit. The American bomber had gone down in flames northeast of Hamburg, and Hoffman had learned a crucial lesson. The flying fortress was only a fortress when it wasn't alone. He'd shared this observation with his squadron commander, who'd smiled knowingly. "You're learning what the old hands already know, Klaus. The Americans build strong formations, but nature always provides stragglers. The wounded, the lost, the unlucky, those are ours for the taking." Luftwaffe tactics evolved rapidly. Fighter units received new standing orders: ignore the intact formations whenever possible. They cost too many fighters for too few bomber kills. Instead, patrol the likely routes back to England and wait for the cripples. The ones with smoking engines, the ones losing altitude, the ones desperately trying to catch up to formations that had already left them behind. The mathematics were brutal but simple. A B-17 in formation benefited from perhaps 40 or 50 defensive guns from multiple aircraft. A lone B-17 had only its own 13 guns, and the crew manning them were usually wounded, exhausted, or both. Against 4 coordinated fighters, the isolated bomber's survival rate was less than 30%. By December 1943, Hoffman's JG-26 had refined straggler hunting to a science. His pilots knew exactly where the American formations would be after bombing runs, predictable routes based on fuel consumption and engine performance. They knew to wait until bombers were over water, where bailing out meant death from exposure, even if the crew survived the jump. They knew that wounded aircraft typically lost altitude at roughly 500 feet per minute, making interception calculations elementary. The Americans call it a flying fortress, Hoffman briefed his pilots before a mission. Marketing propaganda. In truth, it's a heavy bomber with good defensive armament. When in formation. Alone, it has gaps in coverage you could fly a Stuka through. Learn those gaps, exploit them, and remember, a crippled bomber is already half dead. We just finished what the flak started. The Luftwaffe intelligence services tracked American loss rates meticulously. By late 1943, the data was undeniable. B-17s shot down while in formation accounted for approximately 30% of losses. The remaining 70% were stragglers, either separated from formations due to damage or navigator error. This information was discussed openly in Luftwaffe ready rooms, but remained closely guarded in American intelligence circles. Bomber crews were told the flying fortress was nearly invincible. The truth, that falling behind was effectively a death sentence, was considered detrimental to morale. On the morning of December 11, 1943, Hoffman's Staffel received word that a large American formation was inbound to Emden. His 6 FW-190s would patrol the return route, watching for the inevitable stragglers. "They always give us a few," he told his pilots during the pre-flight briefing. "The Americans are predictable. They bomb, they take damage, and the wounded fall behind. Today will be no different." He had no way of knowing that one of those stragglers would survive to expose the secret both sides had been keeping. A secret that had already killed thousands of young American airmen. The briefing room at Ridgewell went silent when the operations officer pulled back the curtain covering the large wall map. A collective groan rose from the assembled crews. "Emden," Major William Thompson announced, his pointer tapping the German coastal city. "Industrial targets, specifically the port facilities and synthetic oil refineries. Bomber Command believes this is a high-value target that will significantly impact German logistics." Robert Kellerman sat in the third row with his crew, studying the red line that traced their route across the North Sea, over the Netherlands, into northwestern Germany and back. The distance wasn't excessive, perhaps 450 miles each way, but the location put them in range of heavy flak concentrations and multiple Luftwaffe fighter bases. "Expected fighter opposition is significant," Thompson continued, confirming Kellerman's assessment. "Intelligence reports at least 3 German fighter Gruppen in the area. Flak will be intense over the target. We'll have a P-47 escort to the Dutch border, but you'll be on your own for the final run and extraction." This would be Dragon's Breath's 14th mission. One more than bad luck. One closer to the 25 required before rotation stateside. Kellerman's crew had been fortunate so far. Minor flak damage on a few missions. One engine knocked out over Wilhelmshaven that they'd nursed home, but nothing catastrophic. After the briefing, Kellerman found Thomas outside the operations building. His brother was scheduled for the same mission with the 379th, flying in a different group formation but targeting the same general area. "Bobby," Thomas greeted him, his expression serious. "Listen to me. Today feels wrong. I've got that feeling." "You say that before every mission," Kellerman replied, though he felt the same unease. "I mean it this time." Thomas gripped his shoulder. "If something goes wrong up there, you remember what I told you. Stay with the formation. I don't care if you're on fire. You stay with the formation until you're over friendly territory." Kellerman nodded, unsettled by his brother's intensity. "Same goes for you." They stood in silence for a moment, the dawn spreading gray light across the airfield where ground crews were already preparing the bombers. Dozens of B-17s arranged in neat rows, their gun barrels catching the early light like promises of protection. "See you at the Officers' Club tonight," Thomas said finally. "First round's on you." "You're on," Kellerman replied, watching his brother walk toward his own aircraft. The pre-flight routine was familiar now, checking the aircraft, meeting with the crew chiefs, conducting walk-around inspections of Dragon's Breath. Staff Sergeant Eddie Kozlowski, the top turret gunner and flight engineer, joined him for the check. "She's solid, Lieutenant," Kozlowski reported. All 4 engines were running smoothly. Oxygen system checked, guns zeroed. "We're good to go." The crew assembled near the aircraft. Second Lieutenant James Harmon, the co-pilot. Second Lieutenant Peter Morrison, navigator. Second Lieutenant Carl Hughes, bombardier. And the enlisted gunners, Kozlowski, plus Staff Sergeants Raymond Walker and Thomas Martinez at the waist guns. Sergeant Joseph DeLuca in the ball turret. Sergeant Michael Romano in the tail, and Sergeant David Chen in the radio room. 10 men, the standard B-17 crew. Each one trusts Kellerman to get them through this. At 0730 hours, Dragon's Breath lifted off from Ridgewell, joining the growing formation of bombers circling over England. The assembly always looked chaotic from inside. Dozens of four-engine bombers orbiting, gradually forming into combat boxes, then larger group formations. But from the ground, Kellerman knew it looked like a migration of mechanical birds, beautiful and terrible. They crossed the North Sea at 22,000 feet, the formation tight and disciplined. Kellerman could see other B-17s to his left and right, above and below, all maintaining precise spacing. This was what the training films showed, an armada of flying fortresses. Their combined defensive firepower, capable of swatting German fighters from the sky. The P-47 Thunderbolts met them at the Dutch coast, friendly fighters weaving above the bomber stream. But at the German border, the P-47s waggled their wings and turned back, reaching their fuel limits. From here, the bombers were alone. "Flak at 12 o'clock, Morrison called from the nose. Black puffs appeared ahead, Emden's anti-aircraft defenses opening up. The formation flew into the cloud of exploding shells, each bomber buffeted by concussion waves. Kellerman heard metal fragments pinging against Dragon's Breath's fuselage, felt the aircraft shudder from near misses. "Bomb bay doors open," Hughes announced. "Approaching target. Steady. Steady. Bombs away." Dragon's Breath lifted slightly as 4,000 pounds of high-explosive bombs dropped toward the industrial targets below. All around them, other bombers were doing the same, a rain of American ordnance falling on Hitler's war machine. Then they were through the worst of the flak, turning west toward home. That's when Kellerman heard the sound every pilot dreaded, a loud bang from the No. 3 engine, followed by a plume of black smoke. "Engine fire, No. 3, Kozlowski reported, his voice tight. Kellerman immediately hit the fire extinguisher for that engine and feathered the propeller. The fire died, but so did the engine. Dragon's Breath shuddered, lost speed, and began falling behind the formation. "We've got this," Kellerman said, adjusting power on the remaining engines. "Harmon, help me trim this out." But even as he spoke, he watched the other B-17s pulling ahead, the gap widening. And somewhere in the distance, German fighters were watching. The moment Dragon's Breath fell more than a quarter-mile behind the formation, Eddie Kozlowski spotted them. "Fighters, 2 o'clock high!" His voice cracked through the intercom. "FW-190s. I count 6. Kellerman's hands moved instinctively across the controls, pushing the 3 remaining engines to maximum continuous power. The airspeed indicator climbed slightly. 172 mph, but the formation ahead was maintaining 185. Simple mathematics told a fatal story. They were losing ground at nearly 15 miles per hour. "Chen, radio group leader," Kellerman ordered. "Tell them we've lost No. 3 but maintain altitude. Request they reduce formation speed." There was a pause before the radio operator's reply came back, resignation thick in his voice. "Negative, Skipper. The group leader says maintain best speed and try to catch up. Formation can't slow down this deep in enemy territory." It was the answer Kellerman expected, but hoped he wouldn't hear. Slowing an entire combat box formation to accommodate one damaged aircraft would expose hundreds of men to increased fighter attacks. The calculus was brutal. Sacrifice one crew to protect 30 others. "Here they come!" Walker shouted from the waist position. Hauptmann Klaus Hoffmann's 6 Focke-Wulf 190s had been circling at 28,000 feet, waiting for exactly this scenario. Now they nosed down in a coordinated attack pattern Hoffmann had perfected over dozens of straggler kills. The first 2 fighters came in from 11 o'clock high, outside the effective field of fire for most of Dragon's Breath's guns. The nose gunner, Hughes, swung his single .50 caliber desperately, but the attacking fighters were moving at a combined closure rate exceeding 400 mph. Kellerman saw the muzzle flashes from the FW-190's cannons and instinctively threw Dragon's Breath into a hard right bank. Difficult with one engine out, but he'd spent 14 missions learning this aircraft's limits. The German rounds passed through the space they'd occupied a second earlier. Got one! Kozlowski's twin 50 calibers in the top turret hammered away at the braking fighters. Tracer rounds stitched the sky, but the Germans were already past, executing barrel rolls to avoid return fire. That was the problem, Kellerman realized with sick clarity. The Germans weren't coming from one direction. They were attacking from multiple angles simultaneously, exploiting the geometric reality that Dragon's Breath's 13 guns couldn't all fire at the same target at once. The tail guns covered the rear arc. The ball turret covered the lower hemisphere. The top turret is covered above and behind. The waist guns covered the sides. But there were gaps, angles of approach where only one or two guns could engage while the others were masked by the aircraft's own structure. And Hoffman's pilots knew every one of those gaps. The second attack came from 5 o'clock low, a blind spot where the tail guns couldn't depress far enough and the ball turret couldn't rotate quickly enough. DeLuca, in the ball turret, screamed into the intercom, frantically hand-cranking his turret around, but the German fighters were already firing. Kellerman felt the impacts, heavy 20mm cannon rounds walking up Dragon's Breath's fuselage. The aircraft shuddered violently. Then Romano's voice from the tail. "I'm hit! Tail guns are out." "How bad?" Kellerman demanded. "Guns are jammed. I'm bleeding, but I'm okay. I can't." The intercom cut out as another burst of cannon fire raked the tail section. Kozlowski's voice was pure ice. "Romano's not responding. Tail position is gone. One defensive position eliminated. Now Dragon's Breath's entire rear quadrant was exposed." The third attack proved the Germans understood this perfectly. Two FW-190s came in directly from 6 o'clock, the dead zone where Romano's twin 50s should have been providing overlapping fire. Kozlowski tried to engage from the top turret, but his field of fire was limited to high rear angles. The German rounds tore through Dragon's Breath's undefended tail. Kellerman felt the rudder pedals go mushy, hydraulic failure. More metal fragments screamed through the fuselage. "Left waist gun position hit," Martinez shouted. "Walker's down." Kellerman's mind raced through the mathematics of survival. They'd lost the tail guns and one waist position in less than 2 minutes. With each gun position eliminated, the gaps in their defensive coverage grew wider. The Germans were systematically destroying Dragon's Breath's ability to defend itself, turning the mighty flying fortress into a helpless target. "Skipper, we need to dive," Harmon urged, his face pale. "Get below the cloud deck. Maybe we can lose them." But Kellerman knew that was death too. Lower altitude meant slower speed with their damaged aircraft. It meant being even farther from help. And it meant the Germans could attack from above with even more energy. Another attack run, this time from 10 o'clock level, right at the cockpit. Kellerman saw the FW-190 growing in the windscreen, saw the winking flashes from its nose-mounted cannons. He threw Dragon's Breath into a desperate dive, the controls sluggish from damage. The German rounds passed overhead, but DeLuca's panicked voice came through. "I can't rotate. The ball turret's jammed." Another gun position lost. "Chen, get on the radio," Kellerman ordered. "Mayday call. Any Allied aircraft in the area." But Chen's position was silent. When Walker crawled forward to check, he found the radio operator slumped over his equipment, a cannon round having punched through the radio room. Dragon's Breath was now down to 6 functioning guns out of 13. The aircraft was smoking from multiple hits, and the German fighters were circling for another pass. Through his cockpit window, Kellerman could see the English Channel, still 40 miles away. 40 miles that might as well have been 400. "We have to bail out." Harmon's voice was steady but insistent. "Skip, we're not going to make it. We're over land. The crew can scatter, evade, and escape. But if we wait until we're over water—" Kellerman knew Harmon was right. The standard procedure for a critically damaged bomber over occupied territory was simple. Ring the bailout bell, let the crew jump, hope they could evade capture long enough for the resistance to find them. But Dragon's Breath wasn't carrying a standard crew anymore. Romano was dead or dying in the tail. Chen died in the radio room. Walker was severely wounded, bleeding from shrapnel wounds. DeLuca was trapped in the jammed ball turret, unable to rotate his position to the access hatch. "We bail out. We leave 3 men," Kellerman said quietly. "Walker can't jump in his condition. DeLuca's trapped. And I'm not sure Romano's even conscious." "Then we land," Morrison suggested from the navigator's station. "Put her down in a field. German field hospitals." "You know what happens to wounded prisoners," Kozlowski interrupted, his voice harsh. "I had a buddy from basic training, got shot up over France, captured. Germans sent him to a stalag barely able to walk. He died from infection 3 weeks later because they didn't waste medical supplies on enemy prisoners." The intercom went silent, except for the sound of wind howling through Dragon's Breath's torn fuselage and the laboring roar of 3 engines. Kellerman made his decision. "We're going home," he said. "All of us. Together." "Lieutenant," Harmon started. "That's an order," Kellerman cut him off. "Kozlowski, Hughes, you're still mobile. Help Walker stabilize himself. Morrison, give me a direct heading to the closest English airfield that can handle an emergency landing. Everyone else, whatever guns still work, keep those fighters off us." Through the cockpit glass, he could see the FW-190s reforming for another attack. They knew Dragon's Breath was dying. They just didn't know Kellerman had no intention of letting them finish the job. The number 2 engine's oil pressure gauge began fluctuating. Damage from the last attack run. Kellerman watched it carefully, knowing that losing a second engine would make level flight impossible. They were already descending at nearly 300 feet per minute, despite full power on the remaining engines. "Fighters coming in, 9 o'clock level," Martinez called from the right waist position. But this time, the German attack faltered. One of the FW-190s broke off suddenly, black smoke trailing from its engine. Then another peeled away. "They're leaving," Hughes shouted from the nose. "They're breaking off." Kellerman didn't celebrate. He'd seen this before. German fighters reaching their fuel limits or running low on ammunition. Hoffman's pilots had spent their guns methodically destroying Dragon's Breath's defenses. Now they were heading back to base, confident the crippled bomber would never make it home. "Morrison, how far is the coast?" 32 miles, Skipper, but we're at 11,000 feet and still descending. By the time we reach the water, we'll be at maybe 6,000. Kellerman did the calculation. Cross the coast at 6,000 feet. Continue descending at current rate. English coast was approximately 120 miles beyond. They'd hit sea level with maybe 30 miles still to go. "Give me every field within gliding distance of our projected path," Kellerman ordered. "Include fighter bases, anything with a runway." The next 20 minutes were a masterclass in desperate flying. Kellerman adjusted mixture settings to squeeze maximum efficiency from the failing engines. He trimmed the aircraft into a shallow descent that traded altitude for distance. He watched the oil pressure on number 2 engine drop steadily, knowing it was only a matter of time before it seized completely. Dragon's Breath crossed the Dutch coast at 4,800 feet, low enough that Kellerman could see individual buildings in the coastal towns, low enough that any German anti-aircraft gunner with initiative could finish them off. But no one shot. Maybe they figured the bomber was already dead. Maybe they wanted to save their ammunition. It didn't matter. "English coast in sight," Morrison announced. 40 miles. The number 2 engine's oil pressure hit 0. The engine seized with a grinding scream of metal on metal. Kellerman immediately feathered the propeller and shut down the fuel flow, but now Dragon's Breath was flying on just 2 engines, numbers 1 and 4, the outboard motors on each wing. "We're not going to make Ridgewell," Harmon said, stating the obvious. "Morrison, closest emergency field?" "Manston. It's on the Kent coast, built specifically for damaged bombers. 28 miles from our current position. Kellerman looked at the altimeter, 2,100 feet, descending at 400 feet per minute. Simple math. They'd be at 300 feet when they crossed the coast. Manston or the ocean? Martinez, Hughes, get Walker and DeLuca ready for crash positions. Kozlowski, check on Romano one more time. Kozlowski's voice came back a moment later, quiet. He's gone, Skipper. Dragon's Breath crossed into Allied airspace at 480 feet above the cold December water of the English Channel. The Kent coastline appeared through the haze, and Kellerman could see the emergency runway at Manston, a broad strip of concrete designed for exactly this scenario. Manston Tower, this is Army Air Force bomber Dragon's Breath requesting immediate emergency landing. We have wounded aboard, 2 engines out, hydraulic failure, and we're coming in hot. The tower's response was immediate. Dragon's Breath, you are cleared for emergency landing on any runway. Crash crews are standing by. Kellerman lined up for the final approach with 200 feet of altitude and 2 engines struggling to keep them airborne. The landing gear came down. Thank God the mechanical backup still worked, and he aimed for the numbers painted on the runway. Dragon's Breath hit hard, the damaged airframe groaning in protest. Without hydraulic pressure, Kellerman had no brakes. The bomber rolled down the runway, finally skidding to a stop in the grass beyond. Fire trucks and ambulances were already racing toward them. "Everyone out!" Kellerman ordered. No. He stayed at the controls until every surviving crew member was clear, watching Walker and DeLuca being carried out by medics and seeing the body bag team heading toward the tail section. When Kellerman finally climbed out, his legs nearly gave out. He'd been flying on pure adrenaline for 2 hours. Now, standing on solid ground, the weight of what had happened crashed down on him. Dragon's Breath sat behind him, torn and bleeding hydraulic fluid and fuel, an impossible flight that should have ended with 10 men dying over Germany. But 7 had made it home, and Robert Kellerman was about to discover that survival came with a price no one had warned him about. The debriefing room at Manston was small, windowless, and filled with cigarette smoke. Captain William Bradford from 8th Air Force Intelligence sat across a scarred wooden table from Kellerman, a notepad and pencil ready. "Walk me through it again, Lieutenant," Bradford said, his tone neutral but tired. This was probably his 4th debriefing of the day. December 11th had been costly for the 8th Air Force. Kellerman recounted the mission for the 2nd time. The engine failure, falling behind the formation, the coordinated German fighter attacks, the systematic destruction of Dragon's Breath's defensive positions. They knew exactly what they were doing, Kellerman explained, leaning forward. This wasn't opportunistic. They attacked from specific angles, angles where our defensive coverage had gaps. The moment we lost the tail guns, they came in directly from our 6. When the ball turret jammed, they attacked from below. It was tactical, Bradford finished, still writing. Yes, like they'd studied our defensive gun positions and knew precisely where we were vulnerable. Kellerman paused. "Captain, the flying fortress isn't as impregnable as we've been told. Those 16 guns are worthless if you fall behind the formation," Bradford interrupted, looking up from his notes. "We know, Lieutenant." The room went silent, except for the distant sound of aircraft engines outside. "You know?" Kellerman's voice was flat with disbelief. Bradford sighed and set down his pencil. "Lieutenant Kellerman, what I'm about to tell you is classified, but given what you've been through, you deserve to hear it. The B-17's defensive capabilities are exactly as advertised when the aircraft operates within a combat box formation. The overlapping fields of fire from multiple aircraft create an effective defensive shield. But alone, the B-17 has significant vulnerabilities," Bradford confirmed. "Gaps in defensive coverage that an experienced enemy pilot can exploit. We've known this since early 1943. The Luftwaffe has known it even longer. Kellerman felt ice forming in his stomach. Then why aren't crews briefed on this? Why do we think? Because the strategic bombing campaign depends on crews believing their aircraft can protect them, Bradford said quietly. If every pilot knew that falling behind formation is effectively a death sentence, if they knew the true loss rates for stragglers, morale would collapse. Men need to believe they have a fighting chance. A fighting chance, Kellerman repeated, his voice rising. Captain, how many crews have we lost because they didn't know? My brother, he stopped. The memory of Thomas's B-17 spiraling out of formation over Bremen suddenly taking on horrific new meaning. My brother's crew, they fell behind in June. Were they? Bradford's expression answered before his words did. I don't have the specific mission report, but if they were separated from formation over Germany, then yes, they would have been targeted using the same tactics you encountered. They knew they were going to die. The whole way down they knew. Kellerman stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. And no one told them. No one warned them what would happen if they fell behind. Sit down. Lieutenant? Bradford's voice carried command weight now. I understand you're upset, but… Upset? Kellerman's hands were shaking. Captain, how many? How many crews have we lost because they fell behind? Bradford was quiet for a long moment. Then, through November 1943, the 8th Air Force had lost approximately 2,100 heavy bombers over Europe. Our analysis suggests that roughly 70% of those losses occurred after the aircraft had separated from formation due to damage, navigation error, or mechanical failure. The math was simple and horrifying. 1,400 B-17s and B-24s, crews of 10 men each, 14,000 American airmen, most of whom died because they didn't know the one rule that mattered: stay with the formation or die. The crews need to know, Kellerman said. If pilots understood that maintaining formation is literally life or death, they'd what? Bradford interrupted. Abandon damaged aircraft faster? Refuse to fly slower bombers? Lieutenant, the strategic bombing campaign requires every available aircraft. We can't afford pilots making individual tactical decisions based on survival instinct. The mission comes first. Even if it kills our own men through ignorance? Even then. Bradford's face showed no satisfaction in the admission. This is total war, Lieutenant. We're trading lives for strategic objectives. The numbers are brutal, but the mathematics work. Every month, we're destroying more of Germany's industrial capacity. Every month, we're drawing more Luftwaffe fighters away from the Eastern Front. The bomber offensive is working, but it only works if the crews keep flying. Kellerman sat back down slowly. What happens now? To my report? Your after-action report will be filed with the others. Intelligence will analyze the German tactics you described. But, Lieutenant, Bradford's voice carried a warning now, you will not discuss the specifics of this conversation with other crews. The tactical reality of straggler vulnerability is classified information. You want me to lie to my fellow pilots. I want you to not undermine the strategic bombing campaign by spreading defeatist analysis, Bradford corrected. There's a difference between tactical briefings and causing panic. You survived, Lieutenant. 7 of your crew made it home. That's better than most stragglers. Focus on that. The debriefing ended shortly after. Kellerman walked out into the cold December afternoon, his mind reeling. He'd survived. But Thomas hadn't. Hundreds of other crews hadn't. All because of a truth the Army Air Force knew but refused to share. The Flying Fortress was only a fortress when it wasn't alone. That night, in the transient officers' quarters at Manston, Kellerman made a decision. Bradford could classify whatever he wanted, but Kellerman was going to make sure every pilot he knew understood the one rule that meant survival. Stay with the formation, no matter what. Never fall behind, even if he had to violate direct orders to do it. Robert Kellerman returned to Ridgewell 3 days later. Dragon's Breath was declared a total loss. too much structural damage to repair. His surviving crew members were reassigned to replacement aircraft and new crews, except for Walker, who was evacuated to a hospital in London for surgery. The official after-action report credited Kellerman with exceptional airmanship under combat conditions and noted Dragon's Breath's defensive engagement against superior enemy forces. It made no mention of the systematic exploitation of defensive gaps. It said nothing about the fundamental vulnerability of isolated B-17s. But Kellerman talked about it anyway. He started quietly, in private conversations with other pilots in his squadron, over drinks at the officers' club, during weather delays, in the mess hall. He never mentioned the classified briefing with Bradford. He simply shared what he'd learned through brutal experience. If your aircraft takes damage over the target, your only priority is staying with the formation, he'd tell new pilots. Not maintaining altitude. Not trying to complete the bomb run if you've fallen behind. Formation integrity is everything. The moment you're alone, you're dead. Some pilots dismissed him as traumatized, spreading fear born from one bad mission. But the experienced crews, the ones who'd watched stragglers spiral down in flames, they listened, and they spread the word. Kellerman flew 11 more missions before completing his 25 and rotating stateside in March 1944. Every mission, he pushed his crews to maintain formation discipline above all else. On his 18th mission, when the B-17 flying off his right wing took flak damage and started falling behind, Kellerman did something technically against regulations. He throttled back his own aircraft, matching the damaged bomber's speed, and called for his element to slow down with them. The formation commander radioed angrily, ordering them to resume standard speed. Kellerman acknowledged the order and ignored it. His element of 3 B-17s stayed with the damaged aircraft until they crossed back into Allied airspace, their combined defensive fire discouraging German fighters from pressing attacks. He received a formal reprimand. He also received quiet thanks from the crew of the damaged bomber. The tactical reality Kellerman fought to expose eventually became official doctrine, though it took time and more deaths than anyone wanted to count. By mid-1944, bomber crews received explicit briefings on formation discipline and the vulnerability of isolated aircraft. The survival rate for damaged bombers improved slightly as pilots learned to support each other rather than abandoning stragglers. After the war, Kellerman stayed in aviation, flying commercial aircraft for Transworld Airlines. He rarely spoke publicly about his combat experience, carrying the weight of his brother's death and the knowledge of how many crews had died in ignorance. But in 1978, a military historian researching 8th Air Force tactics tracked Kellerman down for an interview. The historian had found declassified intelligence reports from 1943-1944 and wanted to understand why it had taken so long for formation, discipline doctrine to change. Kellerman, now 57 years old, sat in his Kansas City home and finally told the full story. The B-17 was a magnificent aircraft, he explained, well-designed, powerful, capable of absorbing tremendous damage. Those 16 guns could absolutely defend against fighter attack, but only in formation. Alone, all those guns meant nothing because they couldn't cover every angle simultaneously. The Germans figured that out early. We just refused to admit it. The historian asked why the information had been classified. Because the strategic bombing campaign required crews to keep flying into the most heavily defended airspace in the world, Tuss, Kellerman replied. If every pilot knew the true odds, knew that mechanical failure or bad luck meant almost certain death, they might have refused to fly. War requires some level of optimistic ignorance. Do you think it was justified, keeping crews in the dark? Kellerman was quiet for a long moment. I think the men who made those decisions believed they were serving the greater good. But my brother died without knowing that falling behind meant death. Thousands of other boys died the same way. If they'd known, if they'd understood that staying in formation was the only thing that mattered, some of them might have made it home. The interview was published in a military history journal with limited circulation. Most Americans never read it. The myth of the invincible flying fortress persisted in popular culture, fed by movies and documentaries that showed formations of B-17s bristling with guns, seemingly unstoppable. But among aviation historians and military tacticians, Kellerman's account became a case study in the tension between operational security and tactical education. The question it raised had no easy answer. How much truth do soldiers deserve when the truth might compromise the mission? Robert Kellerman passed away in 1990 at age 74. His obituary mentioned his service as a B-17 pilot, but didn't detail the mission over Emden or the fight to expose the Flying Fortress's fatal flaw. Eddie Kozlowski, who survived the war and stayed in touch with Kellerman, spoke at the funeral. He told the assembled mourners about Dragon's Breath's final mission, about a pilot who refused to leave wounded men behind, and about the quiet crusade Kellerman had waged to save other crews. Bob used to say the Army gave us a fortress that could only protect us if we protected each other, Kozlowski recalled. The plane was just metal and guns. The real fortress was the formation, the men who refused to leave each other behind. That's what Bob taught us. That's what saved lives. The final accounting of the strategic bombing campaign over Europe revealed staggering losses. 4,754 B-17s destroyed, over 47,000 aircrew casualties. The majority of those losses occurred exactly as Kellerman had warned. Aircraft that fell behind formations and faced coordinated attacks they couldn't defend against alone. By late 1944, after formation discipline became official doctrine, the survival rate for damaged bombers improved by nearly 30%. Historians estimate that Kellerman's informal campaign to educate pilots about formation integrity may have contributed to saving hundreds of crews who might otherwise have died in isolation. They called it the Flying Fortress, and in the right circumstances, it was. 16 heavy machine guns, armor plating, self-sealing fuel tanks, engineering marvels that made the B-17 one of the most formidable bombers of World War II. But Robert Kellerman knew the truth that Boeing's marketing department never mentioned, and the Army Air Force tried to hide. Every fortress has a fatal flaw. For the B-17, it was the moment it stood alone. In the frozen sky over Germany on December 11, 1943, Kellerman learned that lesson at the cost of 3 dead crewmen and wounds that never fully healed. He spent the rest of his life making sure other pilots didn't have to learn it the same way. The machines we build reflect our hopes. Hopes for invincibility, for protection, for technological solutions to human vulnerability. But war has a way of exposing the gap between engineering promises and battlefield reality. The real fortresses weren't made of aluminum and guns. They were made of men who refused to abandon each other, who understood that survival meant solidarity, and who fought not just against the enemy, but against the deadly myths their own side had sold them. Robert Kellerman was one of thousands of Americans who flew into the European sky in aluminum fortresses, but he was among the few who survived to tell the truth, that the mightiest bomber ever built was only as strong as the formation that surrounded it, and that sometimes the most dangerous enemy isn't the one shooting at you from the outside, but the one lying to you from within.